Hey, Max, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Doyle?
Good. We're live now
Oh,
on our
really?
next episode of
I,
Cryptosophy.
I had no idea.
Hey, well that's okay. I mean, the title of this podcast is Sheer Tomfoolery. I'm not really sure why I chose that title. I was actually just Googling its etymology and found that there's absolutely nothing interesting in its etymology. It's just Tom plus foolery. Tom referring to just a common person. So ultimately, the meaning of the word is a common man's foolery.
That means you could do something like a Joe foolery or a Bob foolery.
Yeah, well, I think in the 21st century, it would probably be, I don't know, what's the most common name? Bill Foolery,
Yeah, maybe.
maybe.
Well, in the UK, it would be Muhammad foolery.
Is that really true that Muhammad is the most common name in the UK?
Yeah, most common name given to people born in this generation. Yeah.
That's absurd. I'm guessing that you learned this in the book The Strange Death of Europe, which you're reading right now.
Yeah, by Douglas Murray. I am not as far as I should be, but the mass immigration into Europe, it's a bit terrifying.
Yeah, well, I mean, doesn't it kind of all start with the decolonization of the colonies by the European powers?
I think, well, at least Douglas Murray locates it closer to like the 1970s and 80s.
Hmm.
Um, I haven't gotten, so like in the first section, he's deconstructing the reasons for arguing for mass immigration, which is like we get so much culture, it actually helps our economy and so on. He just works through all of these reasons. But I guess it has a lot to do with the EU as a governing body and basically the politicians creating a climate for mass immigration when now we're seeing the backlash of that with the rise of the far right in certain European countries and so on. But as far as I could tell so far, some of the main actors in that are European Union members.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, speaking of kind of far right governments in the European Union today, are you familiar at all with what's going on in Italy right now?
I heard a little bit about it, but no.
Yeah, I mean, I don't profess to be an expert on the topic, but I've been following the Wall Street Journal and its articles. But basically, there was parliamentary elections in Italy, and two different far right parties together assumed a critical mass, though. And I wouldn't necessarily call them far right; I would call them Eurosceptic. I think one is far right and one is centrist, but both are Eurosceptic. And so, even though the parties actually hate each other, they have in common their Euroscepticism, and they were actually able to form a coalition government in Italy, despite attempts by the Italian prime minister to call for new elections.
Oh wow. And do you know like what any of their policies are that would make them be described as far right?
Well, I mean, they're Eurosceptic, so they want to leave the European Union. They want to stop using the euro, and they want to go back to the Italian lira. They're anti-immigration, um, and I would assume there's some more nationalistic policies in there about quote unquote true Italians and things like this. I don't profess to know a lot, but it's. I mean, I lived in France for a year, as you know, Max, and while I was there, there was kind of the rise of the Front National, which
Uh,
was
Marie Le Pen.
yeah, Marine Le Pen, and you know that that particular party is while I agree with some of their policy alignments, I think that overall the party is pretty much a scary reminiscence of fascist Germany. So probably not a good idea to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to preserving the heart of Europe. But anyway, I think it's just interesting. It's been cropping up. I mean, they almost won in France. They almost won or did win in Austria. Can't remember. I know there's a far right party in Germany that's on the rise. The rise of nationalist movements in Corsica and Brittany in France, and also in Catalonia in Spain, and obviously Scotland. But that's a bit more left leaning than it is right leaning. Um, we live in interesting times, and certainly Europe is attempting as far as it can to rebel against the centrist tendencies and I don't even know if centrist is the right word, the statist tendencies of the European Union to try and reassert their own freedoms. So we live in interesting times.
We do. I find one of the most interesting features of this, and I think this is actually the thing that led to these movements going, quote, far right, is that if you articulate a position like the US should have a strong border, we should enforce our immigration laws, that view right now on the left is considered racist, nationalist, and occasionally described as fascist.
Mm-hmm.
Literally defending the border of a country. And I think a lot of what happened was people were seeing their societies change so much because of what Germany took in 1% of its population in immigrants. Most of them weren't from Syria too. And people are watching their countries change beyond recognition. And I think that they've been saying, not no immigration, but no more mass immigration. Mm-hmm. We are not integrating people fast enough. And the left was like, no, you're racist, you have no compassion, and so on. And now we're seeing when you do that for 8 years or a decade, you're seeing the consequences of that. So if you get to a point where it's almost like, oh, you're racist for thinking we should defend our borders. Okay, I'm racist. Let's go with that. Let's play the game.
No. Do you think that there's a difference in just kind, or a difference in just degree, or a difference in kind between what's happening in Europe today and in the last 10 years and say what was going on in the United States in the early 20th century with mass immigrations from Eastern Europe, Italy, Ireland, etc.?
Oh, I would say difference in kind, though I know that there was integration problems, such as with the Irish, who did have the highest crime rate in the United States at one time. You know, the old like 50s cliche, guy walks into the barbershop and he's like, "What up, you fucking Italian?" Blah, blah, blah. There was actual group distinctions that evolved from that, but I think that it is a difference in kind because those groups, for the most part, were Christians. They shared each other's values, even if they were Protestants and Catholics and so on. But the major problem with mass immigration from North Africa and the Middle East is many, if not most of these people think that homosexuality should be illegal, various things about women's rights that we would find troubling, and so on. And we see that being the thing that's hard to digest for those societies. It's the values of the people coming in and the sort of, I guess, politically correct capitulation to what amounts to theocratic values. So I would say it's a difference in kind because of the religious beliefs.
Yeah. Do you think, though, that it's necessarily a matter of religion, or is it, and maybe this is just an identity formed as two different words, is it a matter of religion, or is it a matter simply of culture, or both? Because I think there's an argument to be made that, you know, insofar as, you know, the Eastern Europeans, the Irish, the Italians shared this sort of Christian worldview with the Protestants who were already in America, they had that in common. But I think that there was something a little bit deeper, and that it was fundamentally, there was a Western value that underlaid even simply the desire to move from their native lands to America. Right? There was this fundamental belief in the freedom of the individual, and if you cut the strings of, you know, your past, you are able to rise higher. And I think that that's kind of fundamentally a Western value, and I think you can actually trace that all the way back to the ancient Greeks, right? This inherent value or dignity or freedom that's inherent to the individual that gives rise to what we call the West. And I think that maybe it's that fundamentally, that notion that not only gives rise to Christianity, but also allows these disparate groups of people who are in this Western world can commingle in such a way that it's not destructive to the culture that exists there. And in fact, you might even say that those cultures come into their own more fully, and then they integrate those cultures into the culture in which they find themselves locally. right? So you get a little bit of an Irish America and you get an Italian America. And that mixes well with the Anglo-Saxon Protestant
Yeah.
America, and that is what America is in some sense, which seems a fundamentally different motivation for mass immigration than what's going on in Europe.
Oh, certainly. And I mean, you heard Linda Sarsour say this, the theocrat fascist speaker on the left. She said, "We are not here to assimilate." And as Dave Rubin said, that is the least American thing I've heard someone on a platform say. You know, the whole purpose is the assimilation of cultures. But I think to answer your question, a theocratic worldview, a view that a religious doctrine should rule the law, is inherently a cultural worldview because there's no separation of politics and religion. So I think that the Western worldview, the quote unquote culture you're talking about, eventually did separate religion and politics, and that's why. So yeah, you're right. It's not just religion, but it's the problem is it's religion that it's a religion that believes that it should rule politics, at least in its original texts.
One of the problems that I don't want to call it, yeah, maybe problems. One of the problems that I ran into when I was trying to think through, sort of these questions that we're talking about right now, ultimately, a lot of the arguments that we're making do have a tendency to spiral into nationalism. And I'll give you a little bit of an example of that. So I spent a long time developing a notion of event, which is a little bit I would have to talk too long to actually describe it here, but more or less, I posit the existence of events that are so disruptive when they arise in time that they actually rupture the way that time has flowed from past to future. And what it does is that an event has the ability to give rise to a spirit, more or less, that imbues the culture and the people to whom that event took place. And kind of thinking through this concept, I was able to kind of string together a line of what you might call lesser events that all kind of stem back to an originary event that gives rise to Western culture, and namely that was the penning of the Iliad, which is why it is my favorite book, and that's why it was the first book that we read in our Great Books podcast. I think that the struggle that is outlined in the Iliad with the characters, particularly of Hector and Achilles, two men who know that they are destined for death and have to confront, in one case it's Achilles confronting, I can die here before the walls of Troy and be remembered forever, or I can go home, live a long life and be forgotten. And then Hector, who has the choice to stay back with his wife and child and die anyway, or go to the front lines and die nobly on the battlefield. That, I think, is that fundamental quest for immortality that Achilles and Hector choose is in some sense the animating spirit of Western culture. And I think that gets expressed most fully in the Christian doctrine of the immortality, not only of the soul, but the immortality of the body through the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. The problem is, though, is when you trace the lineage of that idea, you can actually make like a mythological and chronological argument for how that idea influences the development of Western culture. And fundamentally from a narrative perspective, it's the blood of the Trojans becomes the great races of the West. And it's mythological more than it's definitely mythological more than it is scientific. But all of the great royal houses of Europe, particularly in the early modern period, were writing, their own versions, myths, stories of how they are in some way descendants of the Trojans. And ultimately that means that they're descendants of the Roman emperors or cousins of the Roman emperors. And you do get a sort of racial distinction that puts the blood of the Trojans above everybody else.
Mhm.
And while I think that narratively it's quite a useful tool, when you start to make policy decisions on the basis of that narrative, which is, I think, what all policy is, right? You have your narrative and then you put it into practice in the real world. That narrative can be, and perhaps in the only valid way in which it was attempted to be put into practice in the 20th century, was in Nazi Germany, and in a very destructive way that led to genocide against the Jews and things like that. So my question here is, how is it that we make an argument that supports such a thing as national identity, or like an animating spirit for a nation, not necessarily literally tied to blood, but in some sense tied to blood in a more spiritual way? How do we prevent that argument from spiraling into what could become genocidal?
Well, yeah, there's a lot there. I don't know if you remember, but the first time that we got a beer together, you told me about events for about an hour. So I remember that vividly. But I think the way that the United States Constitution has done it, and obviously not perfectly, um, and you actually see this. I actually saw this in my political philosophy class. There was a girl who said something along the lines of, the Constitution's some old, outdated document. We don't have to listen to that anymore. I was like, whoa. You see how far the termites have spread. But I think it's about a value of, it's about a kind of libertarian value of human competence given their ability for free choice. And so the nation becomes a set of ideas um, rather than any particular group of people. And that set of ideas is what's being defended rather than the group itself, because the disparate identities in the group can all align with those fundamental ideas and coexist peacefully together and competently and create progress together with that, while identifying with that idea, can still identify strongly with things that idea allows them to do freely, such as being a hockey player or being a Catholic or being involved in women's healthcare, whatever. So I think the way that you avoid nationalism is to focus the identity on an idea, and that idea has to contain fundamental assumptions about the human being free.
So in some sense, in what I was just talking about, the fundamental assumption, or rather than being a descendant of the Trojans in a literal way, it's those who respond to the question of existential crisis with an attempt to reestablish themselves as a great nation, and to not allow the suffering of defeat to prevent them from actualizing themselves, right? Is that kind of what you're talking about? That's what defines the West, because that's what those people did in the narrative. And it's also what we're doing, when you move from Eastern Europe to America to attempt to start your own business and kind of transform your life. There's an interesting parallel there.
Yeah, I actually work with these people.
Yeah.
But I remember putting it this way. I wrote a letter to Amir Salah when he returned to the United States from Saudi Arabia, who's interviewed in the Specialist series. And I was describing to him like our relationship, and it was a rather emotional letter. But I was describing our conversations and his commitment to science and debate and reason, and enlightenment for that matter. And I said in the letter, what's more American than this? Like, I could name, hundreds of Americans who are less American than you are. And yet you come here from Saudi Arabia, having left Islam, having left theocracy, being willing to criticize it. And that is what makes you part of our national identity, is that you share that value for freedom. So it's sort of like an infinitely elastic identity group that is committed to basic axioms. Did that get at your question?
Yeah, no, I think it did. Do you think that the joining of this elastic group, in some sense, necessitates an appropriation might be the wrong word, but an appropriation of the genealogy of those ideas, right? Can you come here and be a full American in this more spiritual sense, right? This sense of the ideals behind it without paying tribute to not only the framers of the Constitution, but also the philosophers of the Enlightenment who inspired it and the medieval philosophers who inspired them and so on and so forth down the chain. And thus you kind of come to participate in the whole lineage of Western development. Can you join the American nation in the spiritual sense without paying tribute to that tradition that's been handed on since the ancient Greeks?
Well, I think the irony here is that many of the foreigners I've quote foreigner the foreigners I've met who have been my close friends understood American history, philosophy, enlightenment, and tradition better than many Americans I knew. And I think that's the crisis. It's not a matter of so much can we assimilate people to this idea, to this, does it require this full reading, as do we even have an informed citizenry that lives this ideal? Because I think that that's the real problem. I mean, given coming to the United States from another culture and so on, if our citizens actually lived the the sort of libertarian ideals, and I don't literally mean libertarian, I mean libertarian conservative, libertarian liberal, but like small L liberal values that our society is structured on, it would work a lot better if the citizens themselves in that country believed in those values still, or read those texts, or had that notion of nation and spirit that was an idea rather than a group of people.
Do you think it's important that they know them, or is it more important that they embody them?
I think it's far more important that they embody them.
Would you say that most Americans, even if ignorant of the text, do embody those values, or do we miss the boat in both camps?
I think a lot of them do. I think you know the can-do American spirit. That's very part of that picture of the world. And I think without being a philosopher or an academic or going back and reading the history, a lot of people do end up sort of assimilating the better angels of this sort of ideal, this non-utopian ideal. And but I don't think that I think without a full and complete view of what those values are and why they existed, and of human history where they never existed before the prosperity that we now enjoy, that those can never be fully embodied. And so I think that there's like a subconscious embodiment in a lot of cases, but not the full articulation and then the full ability to self-actualize in a free system, given what a free system is and what it means in the context of human history.
Do you think that that's fundamentally the role and the purpose of state-sponsored education, is to kind of provide a framework in which to understand those values that we're fundamentally, living out and embodying, but is the purpose of the education to give definitions and a genealogy to those?
I don't know. I've been thinking about education for a while with a close friend who's also going to come on the podcast, but it has to be state sponsored to some degree, whether you go with the voucher system and so on. But I do not know the implications of saying yes or no to that question. Do you have a certain opinion on it?
Well, it's there's a libertarian argument against state-sponsored education, right? And that's fundamentally that if the state controls education, then they also control a very powerful mechanism by which they can spread propaganda.
And has been doing, as we see.
Yeah, well, and has been doing. And I don't know whether that's like always coming down from the top so much as these mid-level bureaucratic functionaries who are bitter and resentful and happen to be left.
Oh, I disagree.
Really?
Yeah. I think the social justice movement is entirely predicated on 8 years of Obama and the Department of Education and the nature of It's not just Marxist professors. This was a whole Shabbat meal from the top down. Um, and it was a long-term thing. They had to get some very crazy ideas further and further down the road. You saw this with like I was a proponent of gay marriage. I wrote an article on a blog and I think for the school newspaper about why I was on board with gay marriage from a libertarian perspective and so on. But what do you get right after gay marriage? You get the transgender, there's no male women, and so on. I think this was a concerted effort from top-down control, university funding, Hollywood and media elites, and so on, who sort of compelled this narrative. And that narrative was built into the education system, the narrative of diversity and equity and so on. I do not think that this was just a holdover of liberal professors from the 60s making students crazy. I think this was a full scale, change the name of the guy on the SAT to Muhammad thing where diversity and equity and so on were valued from the top in our education systems.
See, well, that's interesting. I don't want to dispute your claims because you have a compelling argument, but maybe I can add another spin on it, right? There's an argument that can be made that the real breakdown, the fundamental breakdown of the university system began with the GI Bill, and even before that with the land grant university system, right, to create technical colleges to promote engineering and such in the United States. So, well, hold on, let me make my point. I think what happened there was it was first you had the land grant colleges that sprung up lots of universities in response to a need that was superimposed by the state and not an organic response from an influx of students, say. But then what happened was there was an excess of people that now through the GI Bill are entitled and having paid for a university education that otherwise would not have received one. And so these land grant colleges, and I think, Ohio State University is a really great example of this, how it just gets huge super, super quickly. And then continues to grow at an unprecedented rate, such that the number of administrators needed to keep the university functioning increases not linearly, but exponentially, until you get this ridiculous 2-to-1 administrator to faculty ratio on these state level campuses. And then that generates kind of a new standard for what it means to be a university. And then other smaller universities that need not that level of administration succumb to it through just the pressures of the ecosystem. And so then you end up with Xavier also having 2-to-1 administrators to faculty. So it's almost like there was a conspiracy both of just one, the land grant colleges, and then the GI Bill, and then you had a structure in which the kind of thing that you're talking about would actually be effective, right? Because in a more microcosmic university system where they're each are living in their own sort of world, they have their own faculties and their own specialties, and there's conferences and such where professors can go and share ideas, but the administrations and the way that colleges are run are different from place to place to place. So you ultimately got a centralizing force in the university system that then makes it amenable to something like a top-down influx of diversity, equity, and other ideas that you're talking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I really like that explanation, and this is where friends like Amir would push me towards a more economic position, which would be, I think paralleling your argument there, there was the statistics that were fed to the public about a college education and its necessity. It's a very dangerous idea, in my opinion. A college education is not necessary. I've met hundreds of people through the work I do. who don't have educations but lead very successful and moral lives. So there was that societal part that went along with the more structural side. It was sort of like if you want to be a good parent, send your kids to college.
Yeah, well, I recall having an experience where my AP government class in high school visited the state house, and
Yeah,
the lady who was touring us through the state house asked if all of us had applied to college, and we all had, and she's like, "Oh, that's good. You've got to go to college. It's necessary." Um, and and yeah, well, I've been thinking recently, and or not necessarily recently. It was when Bernie Sanders was getting on the state-sponsored education train in the pre-Trump election. I started thinking about, well, why is it the case that we need to we already have this system of K through 12 education that really is a miracle that it exists. So why not overhaul that rather than adding 4 years of necessary education after it?
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
The fact of the matter is that, it's already free for the most part for people to go get, what is that, 13 years of education. Why is it that it becomes necessary then to add 4 more years on top of it?
It's because they're not teaching anything in the first 13.
Right, right. Well, and then and the unfortunate result is that they've come to stop teaching anything in the next four.
Yeah. Just real quickly before we move to that point, I want to go back to your first point because I thought that if your point is right with the GI Bill and the need for administrations and so on, why then are all the administrations ideologically aligned? 100% of them, unless you go to a college like Hillsdale or an Adventist university or a Mormon university. I think there's a handful of conservative universities in the United States. Why, if it's mere economics, are they all ideologically designed in the same way? Sorry, they ideologically aligned in the exact same way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think fundamentally it's this centralizing tendency that happened as a result of the things that we just laid out.
So sort of like the centralization happens, and then someone says this is racist, this is sexist, and then the claims build up, and administrators capitulate, and they start limiting free speech, and then it just gets worse and worse. Not because there was a top-down ideology given, but because the nature of administrations is to attempt to appease everyone. Which,
yeah, well, I mean, they have to, right? I mean, I'm not arguing that administrations necessarily. I mean, they did a wrong thing, but they did what they had to do to survive as these institutions. I think, if you go back, to the roots of the Western university system, which categorically was in the Middle Ages. It was not in ancient Greece, and there's some really interesting literature you can read about that.
Marsilius.
Say again.
Marsilius.
Yeah, well, among others, right? I mean, the medieval university system was interesting because it was fundamentally like sprung out of the guild system in the Middle Ages, and the guilds were more or less, you might think of, they're like labor unions, but a bit different. And it was simply that to not protect the rights of workers, but to protect certain institutions of workers that had existed for long periods of time. So it's, if this blacksmith shop had been there for 100 years, well, then some upstart who's not a part of this institution shouldn't be. So, I mean, there's kind of this like anti-startup mentality in the guild system. But
it was brilliant because of apprenticeships. That's a very good idea. It's an idea we could use more of.
Right. And well, but the idea is then that bleeds into the educational disciplines. And so faculties of universities are really just, they're guilds of scholars who have banded together for the sake of having a product in some sense that they can sell to students. And then as that formalizes into an institution, once you've joined the guild, they needed to protect you to actually do your craft without any fear of the consequences. And this is where tenure comes from, is that you have the absolute freedom to research whatever it is you want, and no matter what you find, you're protected in your livelihood for it.
Yeah.
And like that fundamentally, I would say, is the essence of the university system. It's not only a place where apprenticeship and studentship is fostered, it's also a place that protects the craft that is scholarship. And absolutely in no way does the modern university reflect that. It's not about the faculty at all. You could even make the argument that it's not about the students. It's about the ideological alignment of the administration.
Yeah, and the economics of the administration.
Indeed.
I think we could nail this down with one question. What percentage of the population do you think needs to know how to write an MLA bibliography for their lives, for their professions, for how they feed their family?
Not very many.
It's definitely less than 40%.
Yeah.
And that would be a hyper conservative estimate.
Yeah. No, I know. I mean, I think.
And yet we're forcing millions of people through a scholarly system that was meant to be an apprenticeship system for a very few people.
Yeah, the only people that went to university were the people that were going to be professors.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so what we've done is we've just basically wasted millions of people's time for their getting a certificate that has absolutely nothing pertaining to do, or very little pertaining to do with what they're going to do in their life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's sort of the nail on the head. We are forcing everyone through the same channel when everyone isn't built for the same channel. Everyone isn't competent for the same channel. Everyone's virtues don't flourish in the same channel. You know?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not 80% of the kids in any philosophy class that I was in should have been there.
Right.
They don't care about philosophy.
Right.
They don't care about the books. They write the paper the night before. They don't contribute in class, or when they do, it's quite annoying.
Right.
And I think
so. Here's a question for you then. So one of the tenets of the liberal education that you and I both received is that this education makes us better people, right? Regardless of what it is we choose to do with our lives. So would you be in favor of moving that liberal education to a more iterative or progressive series of phases that happens in the K through 12 institutions that exist already? Or do you think that there's still a place for leaving your home, leaving your parents, and going and I mean, not just for a select few who want to go on with scholarship, but for a more broad population who want to kind of be imparted with these liberal values that fundamentally upon which our society is built?
Yeah. After contemplating this for some time with an education major that is the devil's advocate of devil's advocate on education solutions, I think we need, forget the K through 12, forget any education system you've thought of before. Just like let's hypothetically go blank slate on this. Let's do the experiments of democracy. Let's allow education systems the most freedom they can do, and let's see which ones work best. I think that's the answer, because I don't think you can answer that question with a top-down approach. I think schools need to be constrained and pressured along with markets and other demands that they produce students in such a way. And I think the centralization of power is the biggest problem. We don't know how education would work if it was 50% at home, 50% you started working a job in high school, and you only had half the credit hour load. How would that work? We don't know. We could do something completely different. How about you just work in high school and you have basically career facilitated education, 3 times a week at night for 2 hours that focused on what you're doing at work, where you're going next, what you want to do in the future, how this job's moving you towards that. Why don't we try that? Who says high schoolers can't be part of an economy? But we don't know because of the centralization. We don't know how many possible good ways there are to educate people because it's this top-down system.
Right. Well, I think, and if you look at the tradition, in the history of our society, it's clearly the best way of educating people is through apprenticeships. Apprenticeships are what gave the gave the economy that we have its life long before the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
But this is reminding me of an interesting point that Joe Rogan and what was the sleep doctor's name?
Matthew Walker.
Yeah, that the Matthew Walker point was
I need to get this book. It's called Why We Sleep.
why we sleep. Well, but one of the points made in that podcast, which was brilliant, was that our school hours and our education hours have fundamentally been changing so as to accommodate working parents.
Mm.
Which is to say that there's something in the both parents working and neither can take care of kids during 9 to 5 hours is why the kids get locked in institutions of learning during those hours.
Yeah, I call it glorified babysitting.
Glorified babysitting, which it might be justified if we actually were taught things, and that's.
But you can't teach a whole population the same set of things.
Right.
That's not how human personality works. I am absolutely hopeless at chemistry and calculus. Absolutely hopeless. But I did sit in these classes and, as an admission of moral vice, cheated occasionally and, studied enough to get the C. Because I am not constructed for the way it was taught, the things that were being taught, and so on. It's just not where my aptitude is. And I think there's millions of people who feel the same way. I think the reason that a lot of kids are able to endure this system is because they can express themselves in one or two classes.
Hmm.
They can maximize their competence in one or two things and suffer the rest.
Right.
And honestly, too, the more you grow in a discipline, the more you require other disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if you go into business, you need mathematics, but you don't need Cartesian calculus.
Right.
You're more likely to need statistics and, other types of equations. And I think we need a system that fosters the individual in that way and their competencies. Not everyone is built to read philosophy.
Yeah.
And not everyone should read philosophy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, that was the point I was just about to make. I mean, so I wrote a reflection paper one time that I was being more provocative than I actually believe, but more or less the question was whether or not there should be such a thing as like censorship in books. Should there be certain books that are not available to the public?
Mm.
And I made an argument in defense of the index of forbidden books that existed in the late Middle Ages, and it was fundamentally predicated on the fact that philosophy is a destructive force. It's you. It is revolutionary in its spirit, even insofar as it is inherently based in a conservative principle of handing on what came before. Right? Reading Descartes from a philosophical perspective means little if you haven't read the Aristotle that he's overthrowing.
True. Very true. But I think I got to come back on you at this.
Yeah, well, but anyway, my argument here is that the purpose of like a forbidden books list is to prevent somebody from just picking up the Descartes and being dogmatic about it, or picking up any other philosopher and assuming that this is the way that truth is. Right? Philosophy is a revolutionary force that's constantly appending itself and editing itself and working over and over again to answer some of these questions. And to take any one of them out of the context of the great dialogue over centuries that is the philosophical conversation is dangerous. And I think that that's probably the strongest argument for a banned books list.
Yeah, it's dangerous. I want to come back hard on you here. It's dangerous only for those that care. And for instance, that everyone that went to our university was in our class was required to take 3 philosophy classes. Like, do you remember that being part of the structure? It was introduction to ethics, theory of knowledge, and then an elective.
Mhm.
There is not a philosophical bone in the people's bodies who took that class or those classes. And they they intentionally didn't read. They sort of played with the most superficial versions of these philosophers. But I don't think you need a banned books list. You just need to, I mean, because the people who are in those classes don't care. The only thing that makes philosophy dangerous is people who care about it.
Interesting.
That's my sort of free speech libertarian approach to that. We don't need a banned books list. We just need to stop putting kids in philosophy classes who are going to gain absolutely nothing.
That's an interesting point. Well, I mean, I think I don't know if this is precisely a counterpoint, but I remember having a conversation with the professor who taught us both Nietzsche, and he and one of his older colleagues who was not at the university when we were there would in some sense like pause for reflection every time before they put the Nietzsche seminar on the course schedule. They questioned whether or not they were doing a right thing by introducing undergraduates to this thinker who is a sheer destructive force unlike philosophy had seen before. And ultimately they chose to continue putting the elective on the course calendar every year in the spring. But I think the fact that the fact of the pause that they had is indicative that maybe this question is more difficult than simply a dogmatic answer of yes, we need a banned books list, or no, a banned books list is a great repression of freedom.
Yeah. I mean, I agree to some extent, but I think even if there were a middle ground there, the middle ground would tend towards freedom. For instance, we sat in this class together, and I was devastated by Nietzsche in some very fundamental ways, and you were devastated by Nietzsche in some fundamental ways. At least I hope I can say so.
Oh, it happened.
It did happen. But looking around at that class, looking around at the people that were in the class, I don't think that most of them it had that impact at all.
Yeah, but okay, so maybe you're right about it only matters to those that care.
Mhm.
But there are those that care that sometimes never recover from reading Nietzsche or Hume or any of the moderns for that matter.
Do you think they would recover if the class sizes were smaller and they were given more access to their professor? That would be my question.
That probably,
Because
yeah.
that's predicated on the claim I made that
Yeah.
most people shouldn't be in that classroom in the first place.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that would be the case because these are immensely the texts are immensely personal when you're the one reading them.
Just about to say that.
And so I guess perhaps with a more intimate class setting and more direct access to the professor, maybe it would certainly be as destructive, but it would be easier to recover from it.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you walk into something like a philosophical space, you're going to make mistakes that are going to be mentally and emotionally painful. And I think a lot of that's just out of youth and inexperience and so on. But there was so many points in my philosophical development that I wish there was a mentor that could have just knocked down the set of assumptions that was leading to that kind of suffering.
Hmm.
And there was no access to a mentor like that. There was no, I mean, because I think learning is an incredibly intimate, personal process, regardless of the subject. And the fact that we have one person standing there lecturing towards 30 people, you just open up a Pandora's box of possibilities about how they interpret it, what they think it means, what they think the implications are. And learning, for instance, in a way, something like this podcast, like that we have done with the books, is entirely different.
Mm-hmm.
And I have the full support of someone who's wholly focused on my concerns in this text and what they mean.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily want to get trapped on education for too long, but I think we need to foster the individual again, because that is where, I mean, that's sort of where everything happens. and our curriculum is far too standardized. And I don't think that makes it dangerous. I think that makes it futile.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree that reading some of these texts without the support that comes from a seasoned mentor is maybe that's probably where the fundamental problem lies. I'm thinking of, the person who's walking around the Barnes and Nobles who's kind of nihilistic and doesn't know what they want, and then they don't know what they believe, and then they wander over to a section and they see Beyond Good and Evil on the bookshelf, and they pick it up and they read it, and well, and we know what happens next, right? It's they completely misinterpret Nietzsche and they start using him as an evidence for their nihilism, which is precisely the opposite of what Nietzsche was attempting to accomplish. But he had to, in some sense, put you on the brink of nihilism before he could convince you that it was the wrong path.
Yes,
but you couldn't see that unless you had a seasoned mentor putting you through it. And so that is kind of what I'm talking about by the banned books list. It's not that nobody can read these texts ever. It's that you can read them in the context of a university with the support of the faculty.
Yeah, the funny thing about intellectual life in that way is, if I were playing soccer and there was a soccer coach there, he would watch me just mess something up terribly and then go, oh. But in intellectual life, the mentors can't see what you're doing. They can't access how you're processing the text. And so unless it's a very close and intimate setting where one or two or maybe even three students have individual conversations with the professor, there's no way to check or pull a brake on what's going on in the student's mind. But differently, unless you want to add something to that, I do have a subject change that I thought might be interesting.
Let's do a subject change.
Okay, cool. I was laying in bed last night, and this is just because you mentioned Nietzsche, and I was thinking about the intellectual dark web. Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, the Weinstein brothers, Sam Harris. And I was remembering a passage from Beyond Good and Evil that was about the philosophers of the future. They're coming, but we can't see them. And we might see the beginnings of the philosophers of the future. And the fascinating thing about the intellectual dark web is each one of its members has their own metaphysics, has their own fundamental axioms. And do you remember the philosophers of the future passages?
Oh yeah, like that. It's some of the greatest things ever. I mean, I think what Nietzsche does is he takes philosophy and makes it work because it's all about not the claims that you make at the end, but the attempts to make claims. And it's the tries, it's the attempts, it's the That's what makes philosophy powerful. And if I'm putting words in your mouth, that's what we're seeing with the intellectual dark web.
I was wondering if you thought that they were what Nietzsche described as philosophers of the future. Because I think that if you wipe away the Christian and, the God is dead, you wipe away the metaphysics of every citizen in a society, sort of, which is what we're seeing now, when people are turning to people like the existentialists, saying that everything's a social construct. This sort of pseudo-intellectual attempt to make sense of reality. You get this movement of people that have, I think the two closest people, the people who share the closest axioms on the intellectual dark web are the Weinstein brothers, Brett and Eric Weinstein. Other than that, Ben Shapiro has a different metaphysics than Sam Harris, has a different metaphysics than Joe Rogan. And what we're seeing is these fundamental conceptions of reality interact with each other. And so the thought popped into my brain, and this is what I wanted to ask you about. Do you think that the intellectual dark web contains what Nietzsche called the philosophers of the future?
The answer is that I don't know. I think that there's probably one of my reasons that I would want to say no is that I don't know that they wear masks in the way that Nietzsche anticipated the philosophers of the future to do so. I think for Nietzsche, the philosopher of the future is not a public intellectual figure. He's not a politician. He's none of those things. He's the coworker who sits quietly over at his desk, and you say hi to and bye to, and you have no idea what's going on in his head. And the front that he puts off does not at all betray the deep thoughts that he is encountering. I think the philosophers of the future, and maybe the intellectual dark web is maybe some sort of a precursor, insofar as we hold these views, but we're not going to share them with our leftist colleagues, right? Um, but I think the philosophers of the future aren't writing great books. They're not amassing movements. They're crafting values for themselves in their own lives, and they're not casting their pearls before swine.
Mm. I mean, okay, so here's a follow-up question, which might lead us down a completely different rabbit hole. But to what extent can you call someone a philosopher and have their philosophy be heard by very few people? I feel like there's a problem there, at least given my understanding of the philosopher, which would be that the philosopher sees something true about reality and how to live within it, sees a method for that, and spreads it among the public as a duty to the value of the method. So that in order to be a philosopher, you have to be public in some sense.
Yeah, but I think there's when it comes to spreading those messages, there's the need to communicate your true message esoterically, so that only your fellow philosophers of the future would be able to look in and see what you're actually saying without polluting your thoughts with the masses in some sense. At least I think that that's what Nietzsche was getting at, though. I mean, maybe that is part of his own esotericism.
Yeah.
And maybe the claim is that actually the philosophers of the future are going to amass these great movements, and they are going to have deep thoughts, and they are going to be genuine tries. And insofar as they don't allow their doctrines to become dogmatic, and they present them in such a way that they can't be that, or they band together in a movement as disparate as those who are members of the intellectual dark web, there can't be a sense of dogmatism that underlies what they're doing. Then maybe they are the philosophers of the future in the flesh.
Yeah, and I think the number one the number one sentence or phrase you hear from members of the intellectual dark web is, I'm willing to be proven wrong, or this could be wrong, or I'm not 100% sure about this. That is their ethos.
Right. Which is the embodiment of the try, for sure.
Yeah. Do you have a robust definition of your head of what these philosophers of the future were? Because all I remember is it being like a very strange sort of prophecy, but I don't remember exactly what he described, except for some ancient Greek mythological references.
Yeah. Not so much. I think I mean, I can pull some superficial things he says about them. The wearing of the masks, for example, the speaking esoterically, not casting their pearls before swine, being dedicated to attempts, not to conclusions, which is to say questions, not answers. But I mean, I would probably have to go back and really read the passages to like draw out an archetype of who the philosopher of the future is. I took the message to be far more personal, as a challenge, almost to me to be as deep as I could possibly be, not for the sake of anything other than knowing that I am attempting to become who I am through those attempts. And so it's a purpose for me driven project. And that's how I understood the philosophers of the future.
That was very well said. I think we just got our next, not our next, we're doing De Rerum Natura, but I think we should do a podcast after reading these passages called The Philosophers of the Future and dive into this, because I think one of the calls of academics in general is to call for a certain kind of movement of thinkers. You see this in the Enlightenment in a lot of ways. A movement of skepticism, a movement of doubt about our previous axioms and so on. So I think we should investigate the topic of what does the 21st century need from its intellectuals through Nietzsche's concept of the philosophers of the future. I think that would be a very interesting topic for a podcast.
Oh, I agree. Well, there's just so much to talk about there, and you can put it in the context of the whole Beyond Good and Evil book, right? Because they're inherent to that text. So that would be absolutely on the docket for a future one.
Yeah, I have another subject change based on this.
Let's go.
All right, let's run it. The notion that philosophers like Descartes and Bacon, for instance, started the scientific revolution with, who was it that invented calculus?
Newton.
Newton.
Well, he apparently invented it at the same time as Leibniz, but they didn't collaborate on it.
I think Newton was better at it.
Yeah, well, we ended up using Leibniz's symbols, but we used Newton's methods. Did you know that?
I did not know that. Best of both worlds.
Best of both worlds.
But there's this interpretation of philosophy that is sort of implicit in the way that we learn the subject, that it was these men or these thinkers that changed the way we think about, like Machiavelli, for instance, changed the way we think about politics, or Plato changed the way we think about epistemology, Plato and Aristotle. Like they make a movement in philosophy that influences the whole rest of the culture. Do you actually think that it was single minds that turned us in these directions, whether it be the medieval period, the Enlightenment, the Greeks, and then the sub-periods therein? Do you really think that it was individual minds that were the cause of such massive societal change?
No, I do not.
You do not.
The reason, well, I mean, I've always believed that art and poetry precede philosophy by about a generation. And even before that, you could say that it's kind of like the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times that influences the artists and the poets, maybe not a whole generation before they start doing the work they're doing, but before that. So I think that all the philosopher does is articulate a more broad and oftentimes inherent rather than apparent, an inherent change in the way that humans are thinking about the fundamental questions. So it's even though, peasant living down the street from Descartes doesn't know he thinks about the world in a mechanistic, scientific way, he does, and Descartes is simply articulating in speech what's already penetrated the zeitgeist.
Yeah, and his granddaughter, 8 generations hence, is going to be working in a bio lab,
right?
On like figuring out the mechanisms. I think that's a very interesting point. It's sort of as if the philosophers are markers by which we can understand whole periods, but that are articulating something which they themselves did not create. And you also, and I'm wondering if you've thought of this at all, but Andrew Breitbart's claim that politics is downstream from culture, it would sort of be the same way that philosophy is downstream from culture and narrative and poetry and story and representation.
Yeah, well, it might even be that politics is upstream of philosophy. So just a anecdotal evidence of this is, Heidegger and his metaphysics. Once he encounters the political movement that is National Socialism, starts to find the seeds of National Socialism already in his philosophy. It wasn't that he changed the way he was doing philosophy to please the rising popularity of the National Socialist Party. It's that the same tendencies that were already in the culture that gave rise to that party were present in the way that he was thinking about the world. And so when it comes to defining the Führerprinzip, or the principle that a Führer is necessary to lead the people. Heidegger is able to do it very easily because it's already inherent in his philosophy, because he is nothing but an articulator of what's going on in the culture more broadly.
That's very interesting, and it's certainly interesting in the sense of the rise of the United States and liberal democracy more generally, because it's as if those chains, by making things not based on an authority's whim, allowed for these causalities to run in like a 15-fold direction against each other. Like the biologists through their work have an agenda, and the technologists have their agenda, and the industrialists have theirs, and the social workers have theirs, and the medical people have theirs. And there's sort of this weird sense in which causality runs through all of these disciplines against all of the other disciplines. I mean, I guess it might be a bit of a conspiratorial thought, but sort of the causality gets very strange when you start imagining like how many facets of culture there are, how many things they influence, but not only that, how many things influence them. How many?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think certainly there's, and this is not a coherent argument at all, but I'm going to posit it. It's that causality actually works backwards. Its effects are the causes of the cause that leads to the effect. And this is kind of, in some sense, lying at the bottom of my notion of event. It's that the event happens and we have to respond to it, but the event is its own cause, right? It's like each one is a causa sui, and it's from these events that you interpret the past that leads up to the event such that it looks like the event is an effect, when in reality it's simply it's the cause of itself that dictates the mythology or the myths, the stories that you're going to tell about that event arising, right? So
catalyzed by like a multivariate set of causes that do not themselves intend the event,
right, but
doing it.
Yeah, well, and it's also, the event is nonsensical, but we are logic centric people, and so we need to find reasons for things. We need to find a genealogy. We need to find where this thing comes from. So we interpret what could have been, or maybe should have been, the causes of the event, but in reality we're picking and choosing what stories to tell over others.
Just to bring this down to earth, because I think you'll have some amazing insights into this. Donald Trump's election is a perfect example of this.
Clearly.
The attempts to describe what caused his election, against every media institution, he was outfunded incredible amounts of money. The entire pop culture was against him. I mean, his election in that sense was an event. And
right.
I find it hilarious that I'll listen to, MSNBC or CNN describe why he was elected, and then I'll listen to a right-wing person say why he was elected. And I think you're right. There's this post hoc attempt to articulate why an event happened, and the danger there is that the articulation of why it happened is usually narrative driven for what the person has, rather than the reality of the event itself.
Well, the thing is that you and I are still living within the evental horizon that is the event of Donald Trump's election, right? The event has not yet concluded. And so there are vying interpretations for the causes that are being levied, and they're fighting it out. And the event has not yet concluded until we as a society have a logical explanation for that event to which we can remain faithful. And that's when the event has actually ceased and it begins a new, in some sense, a new time.
Yeah.
With respect to that event. So
I can actually speak to this personally, because I was among the group of people who said that this is a highly confused, immoral person that could lead to the collapse of civilization. What we've seen since is the economy's booming. Things are all working quite the same as before he was elected. it's it's very strange to wake up in a world voting for Hillary based on the assumption that Donald Trump was incredibly dangerous, to wake up in a world where the traffic lights still work and medicine continues to progress and so on.
And as of recent job numbers, there are more what is it? There are more job postings than there are unemployed people to fill them
Yeah.
for
I,
the first time in like 25 years.
I think in my state, Colorado, I've heard the unemployment numbers around 2%, which is unbelievable, but it makes traffic an absolute nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's even more unbelievable when you consider, and this is a testament to the fact that capitalism really is miraculous in some sense. It's the studies that have been done on intelligence and IQ, which are related very well by Jordan Peterson in one of his talks,
Mhm.
had more or less have concluded that there is not a job you can give people with an IQ below 83 that's not going to be, in some sense, unproductive or counterproductive, even worse.
Mm,
10% of the population has an IQ of 83 or lower.
I've met them.
Yeah, and somehow capitalism has found a place for them to contribute to society in ways that IQ studies would have predicted that wasn't possible, right? A pure theoretical understanding of the data would say that there should be a constant unemployment rate of 10%.
No,
And
certainly
yet,
not.
and yet there's not, and that's a real miracle to the free market's ability to capitalize on all kinds of resources, including human people who can do things and create value in a market.
Yeah. And I mean, I actually have the amazing experience working in the wholesale industry, imports and wholesale, where a lot of the people that end up working in the warehouse come from criminal backgrounds, addiction backgrounds, etc., who on paper or even upon analysis you would think like this person's like a bit off, this person's not the ideal person for the job and so on. But I've had the amazing experience of watching some of these people grow into positions where not only are they very good at what they do, they're better than we could imagine given what resume we would look for that position.
Right, or better even in some sense of somebody who is quote unquote more intelligent, right?
Exactly. Yeah, they have a connection to human beings that's far outside of intelligence, and they're able to communicate that to customers, or they have I mean, not to go too far necessarily in what I can explain, but um, someone who was a drug dealer, was deeply involved in criminality and perhaps gangs, came here to the company I worked for and worked for 4 or 5 or 6 years. I don't exactly know the timeline. Um, as a stock person for the warehouse. And he is now selling as a salesperson on the street through a direct store delivery service. And I think some of the main things that made him a good drug dealer, a good hustler, a good person on the streets is making him a great salesman.
Right.
He knows something about human nature, about the way that people work, about the way the process works of products and demand that someone who didn't have that background couldn't. And I think, oftentimes with these reductive approaches, like it's all about intelligence, that's it. We fully limit what human beings could become given the right circumstances. And I think that is exactly the beauty of the free market,
Mm-hmm.
is that he is now, making a salary that he was making, but he's also getting commission and he's doing twice as good as the previous driver on that route, who was, um, let's just say he was this person's not white, and the previous driver was, and the previous driver was a part of the military, and blah blah blah. on paper, you would choose the previous person who filled this role, but um, in the free market, you find amazing talents and capacities in people which you wouldn't imagine given your prejudices, but which end up resulting in growth for companies and better service for customers and so on.
Well, I mean, this brings up a really great point. It's the leftist narrative is that the 1% is at the top holding down the 99%. Um,
No.
and the uber successful just capitalize upon the work of the less successful. And that's just not the case. And, I've experienced this in my own life. It's, those that are successful can't wait to find someone that has potential or the drive to succeed beneath them to whom they can help climb the ladder, right?
Yeah.
It's the system that we have. And I'm not saying that there's not corruption, but what I am saying is that it's not anywhere near as rampant as the left would like us to believe, and that really it is hard work and competence and those sorts of things that lead to success. And the other interesting thing, just kind of on this note, is that the 1% is a very, very fluid amount.
Yeah.
Do you know the average amount of time that a company spends on the Fortune 500 list?
That was just where I was going actually before you mentioned it. My guess was 80%.
Well, do you know how much time? Well, yeah,
Oh,
it's like
oh,
80% of them.
80. My guess was that 80% of them are outside of the Fortune 500 in a decade. That was
Yeah, a decade. That's what it is. It's
oh,
crazy.
oh wow.
It's
I retained
constantly
something.
changing. It's constantly fluid, and it's even more dramatic for the top 100 wealthy individuals.
Hmm.
It's you can only make it into the 1% and stay there for 2 or 3 years at best.
Do you know what's fascinating about that? Nobody gets to the top 1%, backs out all of their assets, and like saves themselves from the potential of moving out of it. No one invests in just safe things and so on. It's sort of as if you get to the 1% and there's still this desire to risk everything on it. They don't just pick like certain index funds and certain investors who are very good, sell all their assets, and just try to accumulate wealth. It's as if when people get into the top 1%, they're like, we're going to keep risking. I think that's a fascinating aspect of human psychology because you could stay in the top 1% if you wanted to.
Right.
You could sell the companies, sell your shares, and so on, and move to a maximally secure position. And given our data analysis and so on, it should be possible to just sit up there with your assets, with the most intelligent people you could find. You should be able to just sit at the top 1%. But these people don't stop there. They keep risking. That's amazing.
Do you know the story of Elon Musk?
I think I've watched it a few times. I mean,
Yeah, the guy is crazy. He founds this company called X.com, which was a competitor to PayPal in the midst of the dot-com bubble and like collapse of the bubble. These two companies knew that they could survive, so they merged so that they could survive the bubble. And then ultimately PayPal sells to eBay, and Elon, being a co-founder, ends up with $175 million. And he invests every penny into SpaceX, Tesla, and Solar City. And at one point, just a few years after being a hundreds of millionaire, right? He had hundreds of millions of dollars, was living on his friend's couch because he couldn't afford his rent in his own apartment and got kicked out. Right? That's what the creative do with the wealth that they're rewarded. Right? It's they were willing to risk it all to make a better world, right? And to create value for the economy. And there's this thought that they're doing it as these get rich quick schemes, but it's like, no, they're already rich and they're risking bankruptcy to add value to the economy, to change the world and to make it a better place. And I just find that inspiring and really cool.
Yeah, it's completely counterintuitive. And I actually think that this is in part a fault of capitalists. that they think that it's all about the profit motive. I think that it is about the profit motive until it becomes not about the profit motive, until it becomes about more, like being an interplanetary species. Like that's not about. If your goal is to maximize your capital, it would not be to set up a colony on Mars.
Right.
And I think people limit capitalism by reducing it to the profit motive. And I think that a story like Elon Musk tells us that it's not about the money when you get to the money. It's about what you can do with it, and that risk is exactly what provides innovation to a market. Because there's more things we desire than a secure financial position. That's quite boring to a human mind, actually, I think.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about this kind of question a lot. So I'm deeply into cryptocurrency. I like especially Bitcoin. I think it's I absolutely think it's the most revolutionary technology invented since the TCP/IP protocol that enabled the internet, and will have vast societal effects unlike we can't imagine. It's more like you should compare blockchain. I read this in a really cool article on Medium. You should compare it not to the advent of the internet, but more like the advent of the telegraph. It's that fundamentally of a shift in technology. But anyway, the reason I bring this up is that at the heart of a lot of the kind of, the anarcho-capitalist motivations behind Bitcoin is this thought that a truly trustless economy is the best way to ensure freedom, which is to say, I control all my assets, I can spend them as I will, or I can hold on to them, and inflation is not going to ruin their value, right? It's like if somebody, 100 years ago were to have made $20 and put it take that $20 bill and put it in a safe, like at that time you could have purchased who knows what with $20. And now it's like, well, you might be able to, pay for you and your friends to go to McDonald's. So there's like the power of inflation has, destroyed the value of the dollar over time. And so the thought is that if I can have safe and secure investment mechanisms that are guaranteed to retain their value, then everything's going to be fine. And I do think that there's a place for that. And I believe that that's important, but I also believe that you don't truly unleash the value of human freedom until you're willing to lose that money. It's like, what if you had taken that $20 bill 100 years ago and bought a couple of shares of stock with it? And if you made the right bet, now you'd be sitting on not $20 anymore. You'd potentially have amassed yourself a great fortune.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that happens only when there's a risk of not making your investment back. It's actually, it's kind of a pretty basic notion in economics, is that banks actually create money by taking savers' money and lending it out to other people. It's like you give me $1,000, I hold on to $100 and lend out $900. So now on my balance sheet, you have $1,000 and they have $900. And so I just created $900 out of thin air by lending out that money. But that only works if there's a fundamental trust that, or a fundamental risk that it won't be paid back. So I think that there's place for both a trustless and a trusted economy to create value.
Do you think that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are essentially saying we don't trust governments, we don't trust financial institutions, we don't trust what is the organization that runs our banks? The Federal Reserve. That's it. We don't trust the Federal Reserve. We trust pure human incentive and potential as the value of this thing. Exactly what they do with it. It's sort of like you did say anarchic. It's as if they're rejecting every assumption that our economic system is based on for the individual. Do you think that that's the case?
Well, I think the beautiful thing about Bitcoin is that it's a completely open protocol that anyone can participate in, and there's no barrier to entry except perhaps having a computer. Um, and so that being said, that means that there are going to be people like anarcho-capitalists who come in and use the Bitcoin network towards that end, or use it in an anarchist way. They're not going to pay their taxes, et cetera, and they're going to hold their funds in secret. But on the other hand, because it's an open and free protocol, there's nothing stopping, a young entrepreneur for coming up with a new use case for Bitcoin that actually is tailored to the current financial system. Say, for example, issuing FDIC insured Bitcoin bonds or something like that. There's room for both in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and I think that the reason for that is that it's fundamentally based on one premise, and that is you are free to do whatever you want with your money, whether that's to not trust any institution and just hold on to your Bitcoins with the assurity that they're not going to deflate they're not going to inflate out of value, or to trust a third party with them, with the hope of making returns upon them. And that's what I think is really revolutionary about Bitcoin as a kind of a new fundamental pillar upon which you could build an economy, is that it allows for the first time true economic freedom to either participate in a trustless or participate in a trusted economy. Whereas with the US dollar or any of these other fiat currencies, no matter what, you are stuck in a position where you have to participate in a trusted economy rather than a trustless one. And I think that, there's an argument to be made that that's a violation of human freedom. Like, you should be free to do with your assets what you want to do with them.
Hobbes or Rousseau, right?
Or both. And that's what Bitcoin enables.
So, for anyone who's listening, can you explain what blockchain is? Because I don't even think that I understand necessarily what blockchain is.
Yeah. So just to simply explain it, imagine that you are an accountant and you keep records of various people that have accounts with you. So you have Joe and you have Dan and you have Bob, and each of them has $10, say. Say Bob gives his $10 to Dan. So now Dan has $20 and Bob has $0. Rather than going into your account book and just erasing the two tens and replacing them with a 0 and a 20, what you do is you turn the page and you write a whole new list of all the people that have accounts with you, and you write write a transaction that says Dan gave his 10, or Bob gave his 10 to Dan, so now Dan has 0 and Bob has 20. So you have this full record of all of the transactions and not simply the sum at the end of all of the transactions. And then you take that ledger, and you're not the only one who holds it. So does Dan and Bob and anybody else that wants to, and it's publicly available. So anyone can see which people in this ledger have what amount of coins or dollars. Blockchain is simply that method of keeping records in that way. So it's a decentralized, record keeper. And so obviously there are a million use cases for the technology, and it's the real, like, the miracle kind of behind it is, how do you ensure that everybody's ledgers stay in sync? And that's kind of what Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin, figured out how to do, and that was to incentivize those who were responsible for keeping the ledgers consistent across the network by giving them coins, or giving them Bitcoins in exchange for their work of ensuring that all of the ledgers remained in sync with one another. So that's kind of a high-level overview of what blockchain is.
Just to penetrate your metaphor, it's as if there were 10,000 accountants accounting for the transaction.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there was one transaction, but 20,000 people watched it.
Exactly.
and 40 got it wrong, but
Hmm.
those 40 are wrong about what happened. So it's like the full democratization of an accounting system.
Indeed.
There's 10,000 people watching this transaction on the same platform.
Hmm.
Not all of them are going to get it right, but the one who gets the ledger the most right, and I don't exactly understand how this works, gets Bitcoin for posting the ledger at time T.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's super. It's when you boil it down, it gets pretty simple to understand. So basically, the miners who are out there verifying the transactions do it in this way. They take all of the transactions that they see in the network's memory pool, and they put them in a block, and then they run that block through. So they take all those transactions, put them in the block, and then they add another transaction, and that's a transaction that just creates Bitcoin out of thin air and rewards them to themselves. And then they add a random number to the end of all of that information. And then they run that through a function called a hashing function that takes all of that information and spits out a a string of consistent length that is called a hash of all of that data. So hashing functions are more or less, they just take any size of data and they reduce it to a unique string of a certain amount of characters. So what the miners are doing is they're taking all of these transactions that they see in the memory pool and the transaction that gives them money and the random number that they added to the end, and they're hashing all of that set of data with different random numbers every time to find a hash that happens to begin with a certain number of zeros.
Mm.
And it's easy to prove that a certain amount of data produces a certain hash. It's nearly impossible. Actually, it's theoretically impossible to take a hash and figure out what the information in it was.
Like the quantum physics of finance.
Yeah, it's really cool. So anyway, all the miners around the world see all these transactions, put them in, and they're competing to find a block with a random number at the end that generates a certain number of zeros at the end. And what this means is that all of the miners are actually producing different blocks each time because there's more transactions in the memory pool than can fit into a single block. So then the miner happens to find a certain group of transactions with a certain random number at the end that meets the certain level of zeros. And they say, I found it, and they broadcast it out to the network. And then the network nodes look at the actual transactions contained within that block. And then they ask themselves, okay, I know what all of the previous accounts were and their balances. Do all of the new balances line up? Did Scott actually send 10 Bitcoins to Dan? Or did Dan just say that he has 10 more Bitcoins than he did before and they didn't come from anywhere? And so the nodes are able to validate that that's going on all of the time because they can see through in every single block the history of the amount of Bitcoins in every address.
It's a very complicated data picture.
It's a very complicated data picture, but the fact is that it's miraculous that it's happened, right? There are over 10,000 people around the world that are operating nodes that keep track of the entire Bitcoin blockchain. There are hundreds of millions of dollars invested in mining hardware processing these transactions. There are 200,000 Bitcoin transactions every day, sent by users. Like, the fact of the matter is that that Satoshi created something, the ability to send data from one person to another and ensure that the person who sent it actually owned it to begin with, and then decentralized it without the risk of anybody being able to hack the network through centralization or any of that.
So it's sort of like the ultimate, there is no scammers.
Right. Yeah. It's impossible to double spend a Bitcoin.
But it's not impossible to double spend $1 or €1 or a peso.
Yeah. Well, so this is super interesting. So I actually had an experience where I almost double spent money. And it was, so I've got a bank account that, and, I have various stock accounts, and those stock accounts, because I've been a customer of theirs, trust me that when I initiate a bank transfer, that the money that I say is in my bank account is actually there. So, and all they do is they check the balance at the beginning, they see that it's there, and then it takes 2 days to clear, right? But one time I saw the $500 in my account and I sent that over to one stock brokerage over here. Took 2 days to clear, and in the meantime, I initiated that transfer of $500 to another different stock account, and I didn't catch the error until I suddenly had a negative balance in my bank account. Right, and I had to remedy that problem. But Bitcoin, and that only worked because there was a trusted third party, namely the bank, who was able to pay the other stock brokerage the $500 and then make me pay the bank back. Right. But without a central authority to whom you can trust, you can never risk the double spend. And that was what one of the great innovations of the blockchain technology.
Do you think there's any ethical implications of blockchain technology?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, I think fundamentally, Bitcoin especially, just it puts absolute freedom in the holder of the assets. You own 10 Bitcoins and you can do whatever you want with them. You can continue to hold them in your paper wallet offline so that they'll sit there forever, or you could put them into an exchange and day trade with them with other cryptocurrencies, or you could buy something with them, or, it's whatever you want to do with your Bitcoins, you can do. And obviously there are things that are immoral that can be done with money. That's not a good thing. But I think the risk of people doing bad things with money is a lesser evil than people having to put absolute trust and authority in someone who might not be trustworthy. And like Argentina is a great example of this. I mean, the peso in Argentina has seen 25,000% inflation this year. Like, that means that the minute that you are paid your paycheck, a minute later, it's worth half of what it was. It's like that's not okay. And
Well,
we happen to live in a country that, despite all of its flaws, has a decent monetary policy, right? But that's not a luxury that everybody in the world has access to. And so I think it's important that there's a global financial option for those people like Bitcoin.
that's very human-based and compassionate application of these assets. I find it very interesting that a decentralized thing could gain the authority that it has, but I think it speaks to our previous conversation about markets.
Yeah, Matt, like I said earlier, it's a miracle that the Bitcoin experiment actually worked. Miners were willing to use their computer hardware to hash these transactions and generate new Bitcoins for some reason, and they had these Bitcoins before they had any value, right? People were mining Bitcoins before you could buy a Bitcoin with anything. But then we started to see, oh wait, this is actually really useful. And so all of a sudden the Bitcoins start to have a monetary value and you can exchange them with fiat currency. And well, if suddenly they have value, then I can set up a company that's mining Bitcoins and validating transactions. So it's amazing that anything began to, like that at some point the Bitcoin had value and somebody was willing to pay money for it. And then from there, it's just, well, scarcity is built into the code. So if there's demand for it and there's a limited supply and the demand increases, well, then the price is going to increase as well, right? That's pretty basic economics.
I was just thinking when you were talking about cash. I've paid cash for drugs before. I don't know what the statute of limitations is on drug purchasing, so I'll hold off on that. But I don't see a Bitcoin as fundamentally different than paying someone cash for something illegal. In its more trying ethical cases. Why haven't governments crack down on cryptocurrencies. I mean, if it's like cash and you could, say pay a prostitute in cash or buy tabs of LSD for cash,
Mhm.
why is this technology not being completely restrained by federal governments and uh, institutions like the Federal Reserve?
Well, I would say two things. Firstly, there are some governments that are cracking down on cryptocurrencies, and not for the reasons that you're talking about, but because they have corrupt governments and they see that not necessarily Bitcoin, but blockchain technology in general is going to make the current monetary system obsolete soon.
Wait. Let's pause there real quick. You literally mean that tyrannical governments and the way that they manipulate their own currency is unsustainable in a climate where their population has access to blockchain?
Yes.
That is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, that's why they're banning it.
That's a paradigm shift. That's
Yeah.
a fundamental paradigm shift in how we transact assets to each other.
Yeah, well, because what happens to the Argentinian government if no longer any Argentinian or anybody in the world for that matter thinks that the peso has any value? Well, it can't pay for anything.
Yeah.
If it can't pay its employees, well, then there's going to be a revolution.
That is so interesting. It's as if blockchain was on, we started the podcast sort of talking about conservative and libertarian values of governments. It's sort of as if cryptocurrencies are the financial libertarian mechanism by which we can trade assets.
Yeah.
They are, they hypothetically could free populations from their government in a condition of tyranny where the population still has access to the internet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and not even access to the internet. There's this company called Blockstream that's out there that's putting satellites into space that broadcast the Bitcoin blockchain so that people without internet access, with more or less the equivalent of a satellite phone, can continue to transact with Bitcoin.
It's the ultimate democratization of currency.
It's the ultimate democratization of currency. And so we are seeing the banning of cryptocurrencies in some places, and it's always in the corrupt places. On the other hand, we're not seeing it in the United States. And well, why is that? Well, I actually think we don't have as corrupt a system as many people would like to think. Right? Because the writing is on the wall. Like, if the banks don't innovate or use blockchain or something, they're going to be made obsolete in, I don't know how long, maybe 10, maybe 25 years.
It's the ultimate form of we choose where our work goes.
Indeed. And I think that it's a testament to the real freedom that we as Americans do have, that our government isn't just outright banning this technology, because it does have the fundamental capability to shake the status quo. And
are any governments in Europe banning this in what we would consider the West?
I don't think so.
That's fascinating.
Not that I've heard of.
That is fascinating because, this liberal, far left liberal that started under Bush critique of our politics began with this notion that we were being controlled by massive institutions like the Federal Reserve and the government. And we saw this in the 2008 collapse with the bailouts, that sort of the notion that this was all a Ponzi scheme for what we talked about earlier, the 1%, was like the central ethos of our system. It was just a corrupt wedding of government to banks. But if that were the case, cryptocurrency should be illegal in these countries, wouldn't it be? I mean, given what you've told me.
But instead, it's just, people in these, and Jamie Dimon, I believe he's the CEO of Goldman Sachs. He used to just say that Bitcoin was stupid, right? And I think now he's changed his tune. But the fact that, and maybe it's just that they don't see the writing on the wall yet, but enough people see the writing on the wall that they should be willing to do something about it, right? Like ban Bitcoin or something, but they haven't. And I think that that's a fundamental indicator that our society is predicated on freedom. And though there are various regulations in various places. I was just reading the bit license for New York State today that, any operator of a company that holds bitcoins for its customers or does a whole bunch of other different activities, any major shareholder and officer in the company has to have all 10 fingerprints on file with the New York State Department of Financial Security and like all of these other things. So there are some places that are a bit more draconian than others, but
And look at their
guess what? Some people have the bit license, and can run cryptocurrency companies in the state of New York. So,
And I see a connection here. This fundamentally undermines the neo-Marxist or social justice perception of reality, because it can't be socially constructed. Our worlds can't be socially constructed if governments would allow this degree of freedom for its citizens. That they could trade their money under that government for a blockchain technology.
mm-hmm.
It can't be some grand conspiracy, some grand patriarchy, some master controlling system.
Either that or
otherwise this technology would have been quashed.
Indeed. Well, it's either that or that they just are ignorant.
Well, that's the definition of a bureaucrat.
Right. But it's one or the other. It's either we are a free society or our government doesn't know anything, and neither do some of the smartest people in the world that run the largest institutions in the country.
Yeah, I don't think those are mutually exclusive categories.
Perhaps not.
Because who would, with the knowledge of, say, cryptocurrencies, go work for the federal government regulating them?
Yeah, well,
the incentives aren't there.
Because that's the free market, right? There's money to be made there. I mean, so in the Bitcoin world and the cryptocurrency space in general, there's this guy, Benjamin Losky, who actually wrote the bit license for New York State. And right after doing that, he resigned his position with the New York Department of Financial Security, I think is what it is, NYDSF. He resigned his position and then went and started a company that consults companies that are applying for the bit license. So, right, you can see a sort of like statist revolving door kind of going on there. And that argument's to be made, but it's also that's part of free markets. It's I can, as in a position as a regulator, see that a certain technology needs to be regulated and regulated according to certain methods and manners, but then I possess as an individual all of the same freedoms that anybody else does. And so I can quit my job and go start a company that consults for companies that want to apply for the bit license. I don't believe that the bit license was at all put into effect for any conspiratorial reasons. I think that there is danger in a technology that enables. There is certain danger in a technology that enables anybody anywhere in the world to send any amount of money to anyone else basically for free and without any central oversight or regulation. There's danger there, right? It's like that's how terrorist cells are being funded with Bitcoin, and drugs are being purchased on the internet. And it's like, those are bad things. However,
they exist without Bitcoin.
They exist without Bitcoin, exactly. And people will find other ways of getting money to those kinds of transactions and institutions. And so is it important that we have regulations in place that prevent as much as possible that from happening? Yes. Is it important that the amount of freedom, financial freedom that something like Bitcoin enables keeps it around? Yeah, I think that's also important. And I don't believe those categories are mutually exclusive either.
Yeah, well, moreover, assuming that the Bitcoin group is tending towards the liberal side, tending towards the libertarian liberal side, the side that wants to see government get involved in healthcare and change education policies and so on. Insofar as the group of people who are working on Bitcoin are what we would call in the United States liberals, these same liberals are the people who are saying that to call out terrorism is Islamophobic in certain instances. I mean, do you see the hypocrisy there?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't. Yeah, that does happen.
That's what I mean.
Well, it's I would say the core. I don't know. I don't want to call them the core, but like some of the original, Bitcoin or cryptocurrency people are far more libertarian than that. I wouldn't call them liberals in any stretch of the imagination, from like in just a normal American parlance.
Yeah, but insofar as these cryptocurrencies, and maybe that last point was completely inarticulate, but insofar as these cryptocurrencies are funding things like terrorism, the drug trade, sex trafficking, and so on, um, the people who would wish to stop it are people who implicitly support the thing that gives rise to those things.
Oh, yeah, I see that point. Yeah, I do.
And I think that's actually the non-libertarian left and right would have issues with cryptocurrencies for that reason.
Hmm.
They would want to control this. Um, Maybe the liberal side for things like the sex trade, unpaid labor, and so on, and on the right things like the conservatives who would back something like the war on drugs.
Hmm.
It sort of like the cryptocurrencies libertarianism conflicts with our political spectrum in a sort of fundamental way.
Indeed.
Did you have more on cryptocurrencies to go off of there?
I think I'm good on cryptocurrencies for the moment. If it's not been made clear to any of our listeners, I am a big believer in Bitcoin, and
Well, you're starting a cryptocurrency company, and I won't explain anything involved in that. But as
I
soon, as soon as you do start that company, I know that I will have you on the specialists to discuss it.
yeah, well, I'm only a few days away from officially being a Bitcoin entrepreneur.
Through a very interesting institution for entrepreneurs.
Indeed, indeed. We'll have to talk about it once everything's been buttoned up.
You, um, yeah, no, of course. But I think, given how good this conversation is, we should try to tackle something else in 10 minutes before we end it.
Okay, let's do
What,
it.
what politically has been on your mind? What issue, what sense politically in the current American climate has most struck you? Given the election of Trump, given the Me Too movement, given all these things we've seen that are so novel to us, what's been the political thing that's been on your mind?
The erosion of due process.
Ah,
Absolutely. I think one of the problems with the Me Too movement, as it has instantiated itself kind of in our current, I don't know, horizon, is that people are people are suddenly being accused of crimes that they may have committed and maybe and did commit in many cases. And yet they're having their livelihoods stripped from them. They're having their companies taken away from them. They're having their shows canceled and these other things before any shred of evidence has been presented to a jury of that person's peers. Um, and that is terrifying because as soon as due process is thrown out the window, even if not officially, but even unofficially, right, in the realms of the corporations, in the realms of the societal consciousness, until people, as long as people are presumed guilty unless proven innocent, we will devolve into tyranny. The only thing that has prevented us from falling into tyranny is the benefit of the doubt that is given to every individual on the basis of of individual sovereignty, dignity, and frankly, a divine spark that lives within every human. And due process is the fundamental mechanism by which that is ensured. And insofar as I see that being eroded, not only through the Me Too movement, but also in, maybe the like so Ross Ulbricht, the founder of the Silk Road, and I don't have much sympathy for. I mean, I do have sympathy for him because, but not for the reasons you might think. I mean, he's in jail serving a life sentence based on evidence that was obtained through a seizure without a warrant, which is to say, through an erosion of due process. And whether or not he did it, and he definitely did, but whether or not that's the case, it's fundamentally terrifying that a seizure was conducted without a warrant, information was obtained, and he was charged and put in jail for life. I find that absolutely reprehensible, even though I have not the shreddest amount of respect for the Silk Road or his project or any of that. It's that due process is important to keep freedom alive, and I see it just being eroded in a lot of different places.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a movie trailer I recently saw, which I think might be coming out this summer, about the capture of the Nazi evil scientist. Was it Joseph Mengele?
Yeah, Mengele.
I know Mengele. I don't know the first name.
Yeah, I think it was Joseph Mengele.
Joseph Mengele. There's this great scene in the trailer where a nurse woman says, "I'm not going to be part of your hit squad," and the male character whose responsibility is to extract him from Argentina says, "This isn't a hit squad. This is a capture mission." And I think the fact that he was put on trial speaks to exactly what you were talking about.
Yeah.
I know you can't say much about from movie trailers, but just to like
It happened in real life.
Yeah, it did.
He was put on trial, and so is every other war criminal from the Nazi era.
Yeah, and he was put on trial precisely because of what you said, precisely because of due process. He was captured rather than killed because he could have easily been killed because of due process and what that gives a society. But sort of to make it more specific, I've spent a lot of time with various victims of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And um, I don't know to what extent the culture of the 50s, and I mean, I don't know to what extent because I'm, and pre 50s, sorry, but I don't know to what extent because I'm 22, what it was like for a woman growing up in previous societies with issues like sexual assault. So to the extent that the Me Too movement goes too far in terms of due process and a chain of evidence that demonstrates a perpetrator, just a steel man, perhaps the opponent of your argument. I mean, don't you think, given the history of, say, sexism, that this is justified?
I would say that any attempt to take away a person's rights without due process, as is outlined in the Constitution and the laws of our country, is a fundamental assault on freedom in any way. And sometimes the consequence of due process is that an innocent person, or that a non-innocent person or a guilty person goes off free. But it is better that some guilty people get off for free than innocent people are found guilty.
It's actually this identical argument that I have against the death penalty.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, for sure.
That is precisely the same argument I make against death penalty. That we're one innocent person to be executed for a crime that they did not commit, then the entire project of capital punishment would be undermined.
Indeed.
So, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, maybe to close on this and to close the podcast, I mean, I know that there is sexism and that it's often displayed through various subcultures. You have rap culture, you have the frat bro culture, and so on. But this sort of plays off this Me Too movement outside of the realm of legality, which would, uh, or is supposed to do due process. What do you think that the way to correct for those types of, I don't want to call them patriarchy to tap my hat in that way or anything, but what do you think that the appropriate relationship in courting between men and women is in such a way that doesn't imply sexist vulnerability to basic human rights or human decency?
Um, I mean, I would say, without a doubt, what needs to happen is a reinstantiation of sexual ethics that's not based on consent alone. That there is consensual sex that is wrong, and it's wrong for real reasons that are outlined in human nature. I
That's a
think that
great way of putting it.
if you here's the thing is like once you pull the human nature out of sexual ethics, anything becomes allowed, right? And this is the Hobbesian war of everyone against everyone else and the right of anyone to use any other person for anything that they see fit, right? In the Hobbesian state of nature, rape is the fundamental right of the rapist, okay? And that is appalling, disgusting, and needs to be bracketed in some way. So what we've done in our society, post removing the other things that prevent that from happening, we put in consent as the underpinnings of a sexual ethics. But the problem is that there's a myriad of improprieties that can still happen in a sexual ethic that's predicated on consent. And I think the number one thing is that, well, just the example of giving consent while one is legally unable to give consent, like drunk or something like that.
Well, no, worse than that too, in states of depression or anxiety or social isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so all of a sudden, we have an action that um, ad hoc is permissible according to our sexual ethics, and then post hoc is impermissible. And fundamentally, you could have an ethic that's deeper than consent, and it says that I'm only going to enter into sexual relationships that are not only consensual, but that elevate the dignity of my sexual partner.
Mm.
And if that's the underpinning, well, then all of a sudden that consensual act of a depressed person or a drunk person or any of these other things was not permissible ad hoc and impermissible post hoc. It was impermissible in both cases.
I
And so fundamentally, what I think that we need is a reinculturation of sexual ethics and values that are predicated on the dignity and worth of every man and of every woman.
I think that is the best way to summarize what I might have ever been trying to say. The elevation of the other person. Because when I step onto a soccer field with a friend who's played soccer their whole lives, and I've sort of dabbled in soccer for the last year or so, like their way of playing with me is something that elevates my ability to play that game and my life in turn. Or at work with like certain technological things, I learn about Excel spreadsheets and so on, and I have a person who elevates the experience of doing an activity such that I'm more competent in it, but I'm also safe in it so that I won't be able to make mistakes in that realm. I love that way of putting it. It's when you're with another person, the orientation of that action should be to elevate something else inside of that person. If you're the more experienced person, or with people, maybe even people who don't have anything figured out, it's like the activity should be governed by the elevation of both persons.
Indeed.
And our sexual ethics is sort of the negation of that. It doesn't take into account anything that has to do with the elevation of persons, but more just the pleasing of certain desires for often one at the expense of the other.
Right.
Uh, I like that way of putting it. It's, the word elevation needs more ethical purport.
Mm-hmm. I would agree.
Well, do you think that we should wrap it up here? I or did
I think that this has been an excellent dialogue and one which has teased out much hidden wisdom, my friend.
much cryptosophy?
Much cryptosophy.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to anyone who might be listening for listening. If you have any recommendations, any critiques, especially vicious critiques we prefer the most, please leave those in the comments or send us a message on YouTube. Was there anything else about the channel that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, absolutely. Participate in our Telegram. There's a link to that on our cover photo of our YouTube picture. And for anyone listening on the podcast, it's just t.me/cryptosophy underscore community. So right now there's not much activity in there, and we'd love to keep the dialogue and the hidden wisdom, the search for hidden wisdom going at all hours of the day and night. So join our Telegram.
Of course. And yeah, no, thank you anyone for listening, and thank you, Doyle. There was so many things there that I'm going to carry home with me tonight that I think were valuable.
Indeed. Thanks, Max, and everyone for listening. This has been an episode of Cryptosophy.